This is the first of two trauma-informed clinical supervision webinars that Dr. Falender offered on January 27. The first 8 minutes of this are without her narration, but please watch them as they lay the foundation for what follows. After presenting these slides, Dr. Falender presented the following video. Please watch it carefully in anticipation of the discussion that follows.
Hi Joyce, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good. So what's been going on?
Oh, it's been a lot of work. I've had some things going on with clients. Been really busy, making sure paperwork is up to par and giving my clients quality care.
Well, that's good. That's really good. I haven't seen you for a while.
Well, like I said, I've been really busy. Clients been having a lot going on. So It's been a lot of emergencies and just been busy, staying on top of things.
Yeah, so last time we were supposed to meet, I got a message that you had a client emergency?
Yeah, a client had a situation where they had a crisis. They were about to be put out and they were really struggling. And I needed to make sure they were okay and tap them into some services. So I've been really busy.
But did that work out okay, that situation?
Well, right now they're on the waiting list for other housing and funding from some resources. So I did tap them into some things and I processed with them. And so they seem pretty calm and okay about the wait process. But it's been going good.
You say it's been really busy. Does it seem busier to you than it normally is?
I think I'm used to it. I've learned to adjust my time because, I work a couple of late hours here and there, but I got to make sure my clients are okay. Make sure they have what they need.
You do a really good job of taking care of your clients. There's no question that you're very good at that, and that they really appreciate that about you. You definitely do a good job of building relationships with clients, and I know you care about them, and I know they can feel that, and I know that that really helps us in terms of keeping people engaged in the recovery process. And so you've been doing, you do really, really good work with your clients.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. I try. I do try to spend a lot of time with them. I try to manage it well, but sometimes, like I said, these crises, do they have crises. But, I try to be there for them.
Yeah, well, you do that really well. And so I'm wondering how the death of Shirley has affected you.
I'm okay. I just keep busy.
Yeah.
Try to make sure I'm meeting the needs of the other clients. Death happens.
I know that death happens, but Shirley was a client you saw for a really long time. And I know, because of how closely you work with people, that her death is bound to have some impact on you. I mean, she didn't work with me, and I feel really sad that happened, and other staff too. And, so it's bound to have some impact on you.
Well, I've come to terms with death. It's a part of life, and I just accept it. And, I am sad, but I keep moving, I keep busy. The other clients are here. I got to keep moving.
So tell me about the sad part, though.
Well, I think I really wished I could have helped her more. It's sad it happened, but it is what it is.
When you say you really wish you could have helped her more, do you ever have thoughts like there was something you could have done or should have done?
I think I'm going to always think like that, yeah. There is some things I think I should have done. I should have been there. But, like I said, it is what it is. It's death. It's part of life. We live, we're born, we live, we die. It's part of our life cycle, and I've learned to accept that. It's just what it is.
Right, but accepting it doesn't mean we don't have feelings about it, does it? So the sad feelings are still there, even though we accept that people die.
I don't know what you're looking for, because I'm still working. I'm handling it.
Of course
I'm
you
doing
are.
my job.
And yeah, I'm not saying that you're not doing anything. I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong.
Okay.
I'm not saying it. Although one of my thoughts, and this is just me, so, you know, I could be crazy, but I worry that the constant moving and the focus on the work, that in that process you're not taking time to take care of yourself around what this feels like. That's my concern.
Well, I don't think you should worry about that. I'm doing okay.
So where do you allow yourself to deal with the feelings that come up? How do you?
I don't know. I work. I work. I go home. Then I work at home. I take care of my kids. I make sure dinner's done. I go to the football games and I work. I keep busy. Busy. Busy's good.
Let's think in the framework we're talking about. First of all, let's have some positive reactions. One is the approach. So the questions would be: 1, the approach; 2, any recommendations if you were doing supervision of supervision, any recommendations you've had; the strengths, the important things that she's doing that are very great strengths, and perhaps some corrective feedback or any kind of feedback you'd have about the process or where to go at this juncture. So let's have some input. What was your emotional response to the video, or any kind of response? So Jeffrey answered, I honestly felt the supervisor was haranguing the supervisee. Okay. Felt kind of like a harangue. Okay. Oh, now we're getting a lot. You were right. I like how she acknowledged the acceptance and reminded her about the emotional sadness, because we are human with feelings. Okay. Let's go back. Let's go through them sequentially. So let's think about the supervisor haranguing the supervisee. Did it have that feeling to many of you? Forced. Some said forced. Some thought it was really good. She's assumption that she's using strengths. Pushing her to more extreme emotions than she already had. Challenging to know how much to push and how much to leave her privacy. Supervisor started out positive. Supervisee was very defended. Yeah, okay, let's start with the one about the supervisor noting they hadn't met for supervision in a while. And that's a huge issue, that you haven't met for supervision for some time. There's been a client death, and supervision is required. So that's number one point that has to be made initially. And all this other stuff, I think, really needs to be secondarily. Okay. And then how difficult it is to push for more processing of emotions when, in fact, the supervisee's not. And was the death natural causes or suicide? I think if you continue watching it, it was a suicide. So in the case of a suicide, there's usually a lot of guilt, which we're beginning to tap a little, but never really got there. Guilt of the supervisee and perhaps guilt of the supervisor for not supervising adequately and being on top of the situation. Yes, a busy therapist needs supervision, especially during a crisis. And that absolutely is true. And the issue of a contract to meet, that in fact the informed consent should be that we meet regularly. And it's not okay simply not to come and to take on extra work and keep busier, which I think she made the point, maybe not directly, but she made the point that maybe the busyness was a function of the supervisee's avoidance, perhaps. It's avoidance coping with a very, very stressful or painful experience, okay? The supervisee was guarded. There was a lack of rapport and restricting and minimizing emotions. You're right. The supervisee minimized emotions. Now, what were some of the underlying variables that one wonders about? Because remember, what's the essential component? Oh, one person said something. Sometimes there's just not anything there that needs to be addressed. And the supervisee seemed to use business to not feel. I didn't feel like the supervisor harangued the supervisee, okay? Okay, excellent comments. Okay, so we've got the timing. I think maybe we can have agreement that it would have been good to focus on missing supervision. Maybe, number one, missing supervision. 2, focusing on the fact that it seemed like the supervisee is getting more and more and more busy, and wondering if, in fact, that busyness was related to avoidance coping. I mean, that in fact, just seeing more and more clients in order not to think about whatever had happened with that client. And here Cheryl is saying, I just had this situation in supervision last week where a supervisee had a suicide last week. I was expecting a big reaction. See. However, the supervisee said he was sad but was moving on because he had so much work to do. I reflected on that with him and he was able to identify he was showing some signs of burnout. I could relate to the video though, because sometimes I feel I'm pushing supervisees to reflect and the supervisees thinking, what are you looking for? I want to try to be careful not to push too much. I think it's an excellent idea because the supervisee clearly said, what are you looking for? Like you said, I'm doing good work. My productivity is excellent. I'm dealing with crisis after crisis. What are you looking for? And so going back to the beginning again, the major points would be missing supervision is not okay, that supervision is a place to talk about feelings, that even supervisors have feelings of guilt or sadness when a client commits suicide, and it's something that is important to address, not simply to move on and take on more and more and more clients. Yes, activity is a coping mechanism, but it actually might not be the perfect coping mechanism. That if we think about the model we just studied, be a way to regulate rumination inappropriately, or it might be a disorganized, unassimilated narrative, like a narrative of blame or a narrative of doubt or a narrative of responsibility for the client, or a narrative of anger at the supervisor for not providing supervision that resulted in the client not committing suicide. So how we would apply the Miller and Sprang, it's not Spranger, it's Sprang, but anyway, model, what we would do, hopefully this wouldn't be the first time we'd be applying it. It would be good had we been applying it throughout. But we would help the supervisee, and I think the supervisor was trying to do this, to define skills to establish balance and acknowledging the feelings that arise during the engagement. So it's hard to do that in light of the, at the moment of the suicide or even weeks later, but it's good to have instilled this as a matter of practice, so it's not a novel concept and something new the minute the suicide occurs. So experiential engagement, which the skills to establish balance, have a connection to the client, and to notice and label feelings. And in this supervisee's case, had there been ongoing supervision, which is water under the bridge, there's nothing you can do about that. But if there had been ongoing supervision, then one could engage perhaps at the very close to the event in the painful feelings and helping the supervisee to look at those feelings, to assess those feelings, and to regulate rumination, because one wonders if all those clients she's taking on and all those crises she's reacting to isn't a form of rumination, or engaging in just going over and over and over the same event again, dealing with every crisis, trying to be there for every crisis, be on top of every crisis to ensure that nothing bad happens again. So that would have been instilled previously, but if not, at this moment, to make the connection between the increased activity and perhaps the rumination that's occurring about the client. Saying gently, I know when a client of mine has died, which has happened, it's very difficult not to relive it or think it over and over again. I'm wondering whether that's something you've been doing. And the supervisee may say no. Say, okay, well, I'm just saying that if it is, in fact, that is something that is, we need to address. And remember how we talked about, we need to talk about that particular client, what our interventions were, what happened, what we think happened, what responsibility we're feeling, or what we wish we'd have done. It's important for us to have a conscious narrative about it. And we need essentially to engage in some form of recovery, because if your stress levels are really high and if you're taking on more and more work and doing more and more, just moving faster and faster and faster, it's not going to have a good outcome. And that's the way it seems to me from what you're presenting here compared to your normal supervision. So we have to have a baseline of what was normal and what was not. I felt it was an appropriate observation to discuss, but the approach did not seem to, the readiness, because if you think of stages of change, the supervisee was not in an active mode. The supervisor was, the supervisee was pre-contemplation and the supervisor was in action. So it needs to go back and kind of deal with the steps. And then Ida says, we have frequent client death in older adults. This is common for staff. Generally, breakthrough sessions and check-ins with staff rather than reliance on scheduled supervision. Open door policy. That's good, but that also can result in avoidance, like supervisees who don't have to come. But it all depends on one big variable, and that is the supervisory relationship. Is there a supervisory relationship? Now, one thing that no one's talked about is, what about ethnicity and race? What about premises that each is coming with? Have these been discussed? Religion. This supervisor is getting very close to talking about religion. And actually, I'm not going to show the rest, but she does eventually talk about religion and spirituality. Now, that is within our purview to talk about, but I think it's important for us to be mindful of boundaries and premises we're making and what our assumptions are and whether those assumptions are the same assumptions that the supervisee is making. So as long as we keep it in missing supervision, high level of frenetic activity, crisis to crisis, bouncing around, and then use it in the frame, I think we're good. But once we start providing coping strategies that are culturally related, I feel less comfortable, but I guess that would be an issue. The readiness wasn't necessarily there. So we need to make the connection, I think, between the increased activity. I checked your productivity and you're working like 47 hours a week of direct service compared to what you did before the suicide of 27, which was more normative. The best approach is it's almost like motivational interviewing, and some people suggest that motivational interviewing is applicable in supervision with informed consent. But if they can't acknowledge this, to present the data, to say the kinds of things I'm talking about. You've missed 4 supervision sessions. Your productivity is off the charts. I see you here. I see that you log out at 9 p.m. and I know you have young children and a family to care for. I'm really concerned about what's happened. And this is all new since your client suicide. So we need to think about this and think about how to contextualize it and how to help you to cut back and to step back and to take care of yourself, because this is not good. You can't keep that level of activity and that level of crisis. It's not good for your health even. So, and definitely not your mental health. So to set a limit and to have the supervisee provide you with their schedule, to think about, we're going to need to make up some of the supervision that was missed. We need to go over your cases systematically. You haven't had any supervision on all those crises you've been picking up. They need to be supervised. I mean, not to be punitive, but to be warm and try to match the supervisee's readiness. The supervisee may deny, but I think if we're warm and supportive, we have to start somewhere. I don't know how the supervisee feels about this supervisor, what kind of relationship they have. Do people supervisees seem guarded? And it seemed like Casey said, a lack of rapport, if the supervisee has a pattern of restricting and minimizing emotions. But that's a good point too, that we need to compare this behavior to pre-suicide behavior and see if this is an ongoing thing or whether this is new post-suicide of the client. And sometimes the reality is the supervisee cannot address it with the supervisor. Maybe because of previous macroaggressions or microaggressions that have occurred, assumptions that have occurred, intrusive comments that have occurred. Who knows? It might be a supervisory rupture that actually is evidencing itself right now. Right. Casey says also, I was concerned with the supervisee's comments. What are you looking for? I do my job. I would want to address those comments with the supervisor or supervisee relationship. And the supervisee's comment that her thought should have been there could have been expanded upon. Supervisee's comment, her thought I should have been there. Oh, yeah. What she meant when the supervisor asked her whether she had doubts or thoughts about the client's suicide, and she said, I had thoughts that should have been there, could have been expanded. And that might be impacting all her work, that she's got to be everywhere for everybody. And she can't let them out of her sight, essentially, in order to prolong their lives. And Christy said, yes, 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 I agree. Very good observations, because it seems like what's happened post-suicide of the client is, I think, dramatically different. And at this juncture, it's more difficult to address diversity because it hadn't been done before. It's so important at the beginning of supervising someone to talk about our differences and how our worldviews may be quite different. It may be the supervisors coming from a very spiritual or very religious place where they feel religious coping is the way, and they're pushing the supervisee into religious coping, whereas maybe that's appropriate for the supervisee, but perhaps it's not. And it's not our role to impose worldviews or values onto our supervisees. We need to support them in not ruminating, in creating a conscious narrative. So repairing this, it's so complex because we've got a rupture possibly to repair that we have to identify. But I wonder if the clinical supervisor Janet asks is also the administrative supervisor, because that is a good question, because the supervisee, even though the supervisor said you're doing really good work with your clients, a very strong caveat, but does the supervisee believe she really believes that as she progresses and kind of becomes more, I don't know if I'd call it critical, but more demanding perhaps. And probably in most settings, what do you think about it? I think the data tells us there isn't much data, but maybe 40 or 50% of supervisors do both, administrative and clinical. And it is complicated. And was there informed consent about that? What if the supervisee does disclose this has taken a toll? Is that going to show up in her performance evaluation? Is she going to be vulnerable in that way? A lack of authenticity. Create rapport with the supervisee would be first. Repair the rupture. Michael says, Ida says, rapport. Yeah, okay, Michael, repair the rupture. The question is, the trick to repairing the rupture is you can't repair a rupture if there was never a relationship. So you've got to assess whether there was a strong relationship that was altered by the client's suicide. Let's see. Seemed okay, dialogue, but a lack of authenticity. I mean, we could try to repair the rupture, and that would be to be reflective and to say, it seems like there's a change in even our supervision process. First of all, we've missed all those weeks. You've missed all those weeks. And then also it seems like you're not as forthcoming. We're not talking about the cases. You haven't come to me with your new crisis cases. And I'm wondering if something happened, whether it was your client's suicide or whether something even happened before then that we need to address in terms of our interaction. Because in supervision, it's critical we're able to talk to each other and we're able to share client material and emotional response to clients. These are critical things. And if we can't do that, it's not really supervision. But we have to do that warmly and empathically so it's not punitive. And Kirk saying administration 70%. I hate to scare you or make you uncomfortable, but that 70% of supervision being administrative, if you are responsible for all those clients, that would be called direct liability because you're not providing direct supervision to your supervisees. And if something happened, like a client suicide, that would be your responsibility because you didn't have the time to do it because you were busy with administration. I would normalize that beginning interns attempt to stay longer, thinking longer is giving more. I'm not sure what you mean, Madeline, by staying longer. You mean staying longer in the set. Longer days, maybe. Yeah. And that's, that's a step toward ruminative failure or burnout. So important to set limits and let supervisees know that longer isn't necessarily better. Is there any way to somehow increase the clinical supervision from the administrative? Are there creative ways of having your supervisees track their own productivity or track their own record keeping or track whatever it is that's been 70% taking? A concern popped up, Casey said, for me is the mention of the supervisee dealing with multiple crises, missing previous supervision, and then the knowledge that the supervisee experienced the loss to suicide. It was unclear if the supervisor had knowledge of the crisis, and this would be important for the supervisor to provide support and manage risk. We don't even know if that supervisee was getting supervision before the suicide, whether in fact she's been kind of just out there. Okay, as we continue to see the concerns about more time for clinical administrative supervisor, do you see an EBP coming out soon that may change protocols? No, I don't know. I mean, I'm concerned that the EBPs don't adequately address supervision to begin with. I wrote an article about that in 2018 that I think that supervision is the missing ingredient. And actually, John Wise, who's kind of the guru of evidence-based practices, he's at Harvard, wrote an article with many colleagues that came out recently that's saying supervision is really, really seriously needed. And it's a key to implementation science, but hasn't happened yet. Let's see. We're always striving for creative ways, so Kirk said. So if there are any of you with creative ways. But then Jason says, the tough part is when supervisors do both clinical and administrative soup, we're only reviewed on the administrative, not if we're great clinical supervisors. That's a tragedy. That relates back to a trauma-informed system, because if you have a trauma-informed system with the administrators and the directors and everybody trained in trauma-informed work, then they understand that administrative supervision keeps the boat afloat, I know, but the clinical supervision keeps the clients improving and is a quality assurance plan, essentially, relates to quality care and to meeting criteria for competence in treatment. That's really not good. Amen. Okay. So that requires a sea change. I'm trying always to get the counties to send administrators to the trauma-informed training. Some counties have tried to give them a trauma-informed training, but I think the attendance isn't so good somehow. Okay. Yeah, the clinical supervisor, I've often encountered that they're not a clinical supervisor themselves, so they do not have the worldview. The clinical supervision is important. We know even that people who have not had formal training in clinical supervision may not value clinical supervision. And sadly, marriage and family therapy, from my understanding of the literature and from experience, nor social work have that much, if any. Social work has zero, according to the most recent study, training consistently in clinical supervision. Marriage and family therapy has the wonderful specialty certification, but not everyone takes that. So supervision just by default is not valued because it's not even taught. The emphasis on looking for parasympathetic recovery. My takeaway will be to validate my clinicians for reducing emotional labor, positive disclosure about self-care, recognizing when clinicians have reached a positive homeostasis after they work through attending to a client trauma. Good point, Ida. So those are excellent points. And I think this is very useful because I think if we look at the video, even though it's a very small clip, what we're seeing is not, even though it's a SAMHSA video, but it was pre all this work, and this is really revolutionary work. It may not seem that big to you, but it's actually a very big sea change. So with all of this, going through the steps for experiential engagement, regulating rumination, conscious narrative, and parasympathetic recovery are incredibly helpful. And the supervisee could have truly benefited from the model if, in fact, we have it. Okay, clinical supervision is required for social work supervision. You're right that actually there are state requirements for supervisors. I mean, during the graduate training trajectory was what I was referring to. Social workers have to have one 15-hour course before they supervise. It's a one-time course. Marriage and family therapists have to have 6-hour course every licensure period, like psychologists. Whether the 6-hour course covers, it's got some list of things it's supposed to cover, but it's highly variable. So relying on postgraduate training, Rod may disagree with me, but I think relying on postgraduate training is pretty iffy. It would be very important to have foundational training during the graduate trajectory, at least one course on clinical supervision. And I know there's so many courses, but...
And we agree on that, Carol.
That's good. I think we agree on some things. Right. Yeah. So any other comments or feedback about the video? Because I think there's some real strengths. I think there was some kind of connection between them. The question would be whether they could communicate, whether there was a sense of respectful collaboration. And I think sometimes praising a supervisee is viewed as enough. If you praise their work, then you can just go ahead and do anything. But supervisees are smarter than that, and they read our subtle cues more. And praise is not that good unless it's anchored in something specific. Not just you're doing a good job. Okay, you wanted to see the supervisor move forward and explore when she spoke about going to football games. I thought that was an opening the supervisor could have built on. Well, that would require what? It would require competence in football. Because one could use the football game as a narrative. That's like telling someone they're good but not giving any examples. Yeah. Yeah, I think we do have to be mindful of narratives. And even the whole thing she said about rushing home and feeding the children and taking care of the children and all of that. But I mean, using a metaphor for many things is very powerful with supervisees, like it is with clients. Not that I'm making a direct comparison, but I think if a supervisee raises a metaphor, then let's think what the football metaphor could look like. Let's see if we have some football aficionados in the group who could give us a metaphor about football that would be applicable in this setting. The praise at the beginning did not seem genuine. It seemed like a segue to the topic the supervisor wanted to get to. I agree with the comment about exploring. There were a lot of missed opportunities to explore and empathize that could have allowed space to give more direct feedback or observation, said Christy. Okay. Do we have any football metaphor? Monday morning quarterbacking. Okay, that's the beginning. Monday morning quarterbacking. I think the one I would do just from complete naivete would be teamwork and the importance of coordination and planning the team efforts. And if you're going to do a pass down the field or something, you have to have coordinated and planned it in advance. And it's very much like supervision. Okay, you felt okay, the client supervisee epiphany is like a touchdown. Okay, that's good. Thank you, Carolyn. And then Jeffrey, I felt the supervisor already arrived at a conclusion and was trying to lead the supervisee to the same conclusion. And just like what Christy said, she missed opportunities for engagement. And Carla agrees with Jeffrey, yeah. So we have to be thoughtful that even though we go in with premises, and we do, we think about things and we think the supervisee is just flailing out of control or something. And then we think we're being really good in supervision, but we're not mindful of our own aroused emotional state and how we perhaps are coming to conclusions that are hurtful to supervisee and maybe not even accurate. So we're going back to the PowerPoint. We'll go back to multicultural, multiple identities and value conflicts. Multicultural supervision. Okay. So The amazing thing, which has been borne out, I mean, it's not good news, but it's been borne out in the research, and Rod reports on this extensively in his book, as we do. Discussion of client cultural identities, multiple diversity, multicultural identities, intersections, and their impact on assessment treatment is not happening in clinical supervision. These discussions are simply not happening. Sometimes one identity is identified and addressed, but I think one of the specters in the room of that supervision was the differences between the supervisor and the supervisee on multiple dimensions, definitely in terms of race, but probably many others too, which, had they been brought at least a little bit out at the beginning, could have made a huge difference in terms of alliance and discussions. When these discussions do happen, it's associated, there's a really nice study by Phillips et al., it's associated with stronger alliance, greater multicultural self-efficacy, and counseling self-efficacy, much more effectiveness, feelings of effectiveness. Now, even in this era, this book came out in 2016, and there are current articles about this, racial color blindness is being manifest by both supervisors and supervisees. What does that look like? Well, what that looks like is the supervisor or the supervisee says, and actually that video kind of is a racial colorblind video, because it's saying race doesn't really matter. We all feel the same. We're all the same people. We're all the same bodies. We're all the same blood, or something like that. And we're all the universalist sort of approach. Or I have lots of friends who are diverse. Therefore, it's not relevant. Some of my best friends. Increasing one's knowledge and understanding of clients' worldviews, experiential realities, and the interaction of these with the experience of response to trauma and recovery. And Brown states this so nicely. I think that's another aspect of the video that we didn't address at all, and that is the client's trauma history and the client's ethnic, racial, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, et cetera, all of those things, and religion. I mean, just go on and on with all the diversity characteristics, how important it is to be thoughtful about the worldviews and the experiential realities. And Carla added, it would have been helpful if the supervisor in the video would have addressed their diversity in response to the client death. What a nice opening that would have been. If the supervisor had said, when I learned of the death of, I forget her name, sorry, of the client, I have to tell you, I went home and I cried, or I worried about it and thought about it for days, and I'm still thinking about it, and I wonder what kind of response you had. Or I went to church, or whatever it is the supervisor did to model that in fact there was an impact, and to model a diverse response. Now, in this relationship, it's complicated, because if the supervisee didn't feel comfortable, I guess the supervisee might have just echoed the same thing. Oh, yeah, I did that too. But that would be another test of whether, in fact, there is a supervisory relationship that's workable. Okay, then we need to increase our knowledge and understanding of, oh, I did that. Okay. Consider social marginalization, experience of previous traumatic exposure, prejudice, discrimination, and stigma. And that compounds the trauma, and it interferes with the recovery. Next slide. Oh, the supervisee more than once said she believed death is a part of life. And the supervisor did not pick up on that, or viewed it as a disclaimer, as a negation of any impact, I think. But the meaning of that might have been very significant. It might have related to her religious beliefs, or her complete worldview, or the environment that she lives in that might be different than that of the supervisor. I'll tell you that once, when I was working in community mental health, we lived in a kind of a high SES, middle SES to some high. And the supervisee was seeing clients, and she saw clients in the southern part of the town, which had a lot of drive-by shootings. And she said to one of her supervisors, who said a very disrespectful thing to her, you know, drive-by shootings are a way of life for me and my people. And death is a way of life. I mean, it happens every day. So saying that death is unusual and never happens is simply not. Okay. Okay, Michael. Oh, Ida said she glossed over it. And Michael says, can't help but wonder if her view about death being a part of life was the kind of rationalization to push away the feelings over the suicide. That's possible, but it might have been her religious belief too. It might have been actually a very profound statement that related to her beliefs or her coping or her environment or her milieu. Who knows? But we'll never know. And we do need to know. So all you have to do is say, tell me more about that and how that relates to this client. I have some supervisors who believe that concept is integral to their belief systems. Yeah. Okay. So we have to be, I think a danger that we all have is thinking everybody thinks like us. And we got to remember, no, not at all. And part of it is the multicultural diversity, which I think is the next step for somebody who wants to become famous, by integrating the multicultural diversity into the trauma-informed supervision work. It's cultural humility is a passage, I think, to all of this. Yeah, Ida said we have to be respectful of that. We do need to be respectful of what our supervisees believe. It's not our job to change their worldviews, religions, anything. So cultural humility may be a major key. And some of this work came from Celia Falikov, who wrote a lot about this about 20 years ago. And then we were fortunate that she edited a book with us on multicultural supervision. And more recently, Hook and colleagues, including Owens and others, have written a lot about cultural humility. And that is the accurate perceptions of one's own cultural values and other oriented perspectives, incorporating respect and respectful process, lack of superiority in attitudes or behavior, and openness to feedback, even negative, from others. So, and those others could even be our clients. Oh, wait, we're back to I'm sorry, there was a video response. Christy said, I was wondering throughout the video how the supervisee was relating to the client, given it was said that she works very closely with them. What does that relationship look like? How is she similar or different from this client? Could her frame that there has been a lot more crisis, the one reference related to housing, may or may not have been a safety crisis, be her way of increasing focus on potential factors that impacted the client who died by suicide? So sort of, I think we talked about this a little bit, maybe overreacting, but maybe not, but really responding to clients based on what happened with this particular client who suicided. Have the crises changed, or the supervisee's perspective on what's a crisis? Does it bring up other losses in her life? Could she be making amends for feelings of doubt, guilt that she hadn't done enough? No idea if any of these are relevant, but these are some of the opportunities that came to my mind while watching. I think there really was an incredible gold mine of possibilities. Not that we want to become a therapist to this supervisee. And actually, that was another danger, that a little bit, if I'd have left it on a little longer, it was beginning to sound like a therapy session, or at least a person trying to do therapy, but not getting any response. But I think you're right that there were certain themes that would be important that relate to client work. I find it, I'm wondering whether all this focus on crisis and dealing with crisis and housing and all that, is it all related to your client who died? And maybe using the words who died is safer to the supervisee than saying suicided, because she didn't say suicide until the supervisor says it very late in the video. Could she be, yes, waging? Yeah, these are really good points, Christy. Thank you. So, yeah, all of you have provided wonderful insights. I love your chats. This is almost like being live, right? A step away. And I'm hopeful that in future webinars, we can have more interactive because it's much more fun, I think, and much more productive. But you're doing a great job. And Michael said, I think we have to be really careful crossing the line into conducting therapy. Yes, and I think that was a possible error in this video. We do not want to become therapists, but we do want to keep our focus on the meaning of the event and the meaning of everything for ongoing work with clients, what meaning's being attached, and whether the meaning is purposeful or whether it's a result of the trauma of the death or the trauma of needing to be so activated and so productive. Okay, Ida said she agrees with Michael that we have to be very careful. So what actually happened after I stopped the video is the supervisor actually began to sound even more like a therapist. I'm very concerned about you, and I'm concerned about your mental health and like that. There are ways of giving feedback that remain supervisory, but we really are careful and mindful. It's an ethical and legal error to cross the line and become a therapist to your supervisee. It also is impossible for the supervisee to say no. The supervisee, because of the power differential, and I think even more so in the instance we observed, because the supervisee does not want to lose her job. So she needs to be highly deferential to the supervisor. And the power differential is so attenuated, huge, that she just has to be compliant. And she was really pretty non-compliant by saying, I don't know what you want, but I think she just got to a point where she didn't know what to do. All right, excellent points. So let's get back to the slide. Words to describe cultural humility are openness, non-defensiveness, thoughtfulness, reflection before determining a response to culturally loaded queries or topics, respectful curiosity, ability to question our assumptions and beliefs in a cultural frame. All of those are markers of cultural humility. So I think there were respectful curiosity ways that supervisor could have responded more culturally humbly. Like, let's think. Anyone have an idea? How could you have responded culturally humbly to the supervisee, but being respectful of culture? I'll keep going, but if someone has an idea, put it on the chat. Consider your own cultural identities, which are associated with power, which with privilege, which with prejudice, which with discrimination, which with oppression. And this is a very useful exercise for each of us to do. And I don't think we don't require our supervisees to do it, but what I do have supervisors sometimes do is do it. I know you have no time for this, but anyway, academically we do it. So we would say, let's think about a particular client, anchor it in the client, and then talk about our own diversity statuses. And those are, the supervisee could disclose or not which ones they want to. So for example, in the one we just watched, the supervisor might say, I have privilege, I'm middle class socioeconomically over your client. I have privilege by being white. Being a female is kind of a mixed bag. It's both. In this setting, it's kind of privileged, but in other settings, not so much. So I have to factor in those factors when I make judgments because I'm seeing it through my pretty privileged lens. And then let's see how you would do this. Ida says, bring it up if she's doing okay with countertransference in her work, and what ways are her thoughts and coping helping her? I would just, I think that's good. I think anything to say, like as time links, like I noticed that your productivity's increased 60% since the death of your client. And I'm wondering what that's related to. And I'm also wondering whether our supervision's adequate from your perspective, because you have the most diverse client base. And I'm wondering whether I'm meeting your needs in various ways, whether we're addressing the things you want to address. We didn't finish all the slides for the morning. But you will be given access to all the slides, and we're going to kind of review the rest of them at the beginning of the afternoon. But those of you who can't stay, you can have access to them too.
Yeah, so Carol, thank you so much. I think you've done a great job in this medium and really laid the foundation for this afternoon. So I appreciate that.
Well, I thank the participants because they've been really beautifully interactive in a difficult medium.
Yeah, exactly. And yes, I had that same sense. So I hope we keep this energy going this afternoon.